Good evening, everybody. Welcome to tonight's event, Eelgrass and Netarts Bay. We're excited that you are joining us. My name's Chrissy, and I am the director of the Friends of Netarts Bay Watershed, Estuary, Beach, and Sea, which we lovingly abbreviate to WEBS, or Netarts Bay WEBS. So Dr. Tony D'Andrea is with Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, and he's the project leader for the Shellfish and Estuarine Assessment of Coastal Oregon, which is a mouthful, and I appreciate it as a mouthful because, you know, our organization's name is similar to that. They abbreviate that to SECOR. SECOR works to collect data on bay clam populations. They also map important estuarine habitats. And they also do things like Tony is doing with us tonight, which is sharing all this information with the public and making it available in a lot of different platforms, whether it be through presentations or through various different brochures that they distribute, so that the public has the information that they're collecting that they're easy to get it. It's easy to get it for them. The results of this data is used to inform and help make management decisions about bay clam fisheries. It's also aids in updating inventories on important habitats like eelgrass populations. Tony is an estuarine ecologist. He has 20 years of experience investigating populations in community ecology in the tide flats and looking at various different invertebrates in these locations. He has been with Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife since 2010, but before that he had an academic career at Oregon State University and University of the Virgin Islands. Tony? Thank you for doing this again with us. Tony was our first virtual presentation of the year, and he is closing out our year too. So thanks again for joining us, Tony. It's always a delight, and I know there was a lot of interest in this topic, so I have been looking forward to this all year. I'm gonna hand it to you.
Excellent. Thanks, Chrissy. I'm just gonna shut off my video to kind of make things work a little bit smoother for the talk today. So I hope everyone who's virtually attending tonight is safe and healthy. As Chrissy mentioned, this is the third virtual talk I've given this year about shellfish and habitat resources of Netarts Bay. The previous talks were focused on clams and clamming in the bay. Tonight, the talk will shift to eelgrass, an important habitat in Oregon estuaries. So the talk tonight is broken down into 5 sections. I'll give you a brief introduction to eelgrass biology. I'll then talk about the role of eelgrass in Oregon estuaries. I'll take a slight side trip into recent losses of eelgrass in Pacific Northwest estuaries and risks that exist for eelgrass. Then I'll talk specifically about eelgrass distribution and patterns in Netarts Bay, shellfish species that are associated with eelgrass. And then I'll kind of end the talk by giving you a little teaser on some emerging technologies that ODFW is using to map eelgrass and netarts and other bays in the state. So let's talk eelgrass biology. So fun fact number 1, eelgrass are actual aquatic flowering plants that live in estuaries and nearshore marine areas. They're most often associated with soft sediments and shallow waters. In most Oregon estuaries, this would be waters less than 2 meters deep. They are large plants, and because of this, they're among the major primary producers in estuaries. They often occur in dense meadows or beds, and this complex structure of all of the roots and leaves helps trap and stabilize sediments in estuaries and improve water quality. And then for those of us who are more inclined on the other animals that utilize eelgrass, that complex structure is also an important habitat for many invertebrates and fish. So there are several requirements for an area to be amenable for eelgrass to grow. Among these are that, you know, One interesting thing about eelgrass is that they can only photosynthesize when they are fully submerged in water. So that is part of the reason why you typically see them along the edges of tide flats or in subtidal channels. They also need an anchoring system to resist being pulled out by tides and currents. And they need sufficient light to photosynthesize, an ample supply of nutrients for photosynthesis to occur. And they also need moderate temperatures to grow. Because of these requirements, there are a number of adaptations that have evolved in eelgrass. One of the most recognizable is their flattened long leaves that can reach 2 meters in length. They are salt tolerant plants, and they can also photosynthesize at fairly low light levels. They have an extensive root rhizome system to anchor themselves in the seafloor, and they can absorb nutrients both through their leaves and root systems. And they also reproduce both sexually and asexually, so they can create flowering shoots and create seeds. And so on the left here is an example of flowering or reproductive shoot that you can see on eelgrass. Is actually taken from Netarts Bay, where you can see the seeds there. But they can also reproduce asexually through vegetative propagation from their rhizome system in the sediments. And so let's talk a little bit about the basic components of an eelgrass plant. So the figure here on the left shows a basic schematic of an eelgrass plant. The leaves are the part of the plant that we see above the sediment. They're held together with a leaf sheath here that can hold multiple leaves. And all of the leaves in a single leaf sheath, along with the leaf sheath, is called a shoot. And so you'll see that commonly referred to when you talk about eelgrasses, and definitely from those of us who are eelgrass ecologists, because we talk about shoot density of eelgrass. And when we're talking about that, we're talking about not just not individual leaves, but essentially the cluster of leaves associated with a particular part of the plant. Below the sediment, they have roots that can grow as needed, both directly from the shoot as well as from the rhizome system. And then they also have this horizontal rhizome system, and the photo on the left shows kind of that growing sideways in the sediment. And so that's part of the vegetative propagation that can occur with eelgrass plants. And it also allows rapid expansion of eelgrass into a better meadow when conditions are good. There are 2 species of eelgrass that are commonly found in Oregon and many Pacific Northwest estuaries. On the left here is the native eelgrass, Zostera marina. And then on the right here is the non-native species, Zostera japonica. Zostera marina is found in temperate parts of the North Atlantic and North Pacific and is among the most widely distributed eelgrasses globally. It is the species referred to when we use the common name eelgrass. This means that if you were on the Atlantic coast of the US and had a conversation with a random person on the street about eelgrass, I mean, you know, who wouldn't? And you would actually be talking about the same species, because they have Zostera marina on the East Coast as well as here on the West Coast. In contrast, Zostera japonica is native to Asia, but has been expanding in Pacific Northwest estuaries over the last 20 years. And I'll talk a little bit more about this species later in the talk. Through much of this section of the talk, when I'm talking about eelgrass, I am specifically referring to the native species. So what drives some of the distribution of eelgrass? Well, in contrast to marsh plants, seagrasses can only photosynthesize when they're fully submerged in the water. So they're typically found in the lower intertidal to subtidal areas of estuaries. The figure on the right shows the relative distribution of eelgrass by tide height or height along the shore. Most of the eelgrass is found from about +3 feet to -3 feet, with most of the eelgrass found here at the mean tide level, or 0 tide level. So this distribution on the deeper side is primarily driven by light, and how much light is getting to the seafloor for the eelgrass. And on the upper side, the distribution is driven primarily by exposure, temperature, and desiccation stress for that. Production of leaves by eelgrass is highly seasonal in Oregon estuaries and are concentrated in a growing season from June to September. Peak production is usually in July to August, and you can see this in this purple shaded graph here on this slide, which is essentially leaf production rates found in Yaquina Bay eelgrass beds. Leaves grow continuously throughout the growing season, and the lifetime of an individual leaf is between 30 to 50 days. After that time, the leaf sloughs off the plant as it grows new leaves from the base of the shoot. This is why you see so many leaves floating around the bay all year long. After the growing season, the plants slow their growth, and large numbers of these leaves are then sloughed off the plants during the fall and winter. And anyone who's used the Netarts boat launch anytime in the fall and winter after there's a southerly storm knows this, since there can be 1 to 2 feet of eelgrass leaves accumulating on the launch that you might even need to rake away before you can even launch your boat. Now that you know a bit about the plant itself, let's talk about the role of eelgrass in estuaries. So eelgrass are considered foundation species or ecosystem engineers, and these terms refer to organisms such as eelgrass that modify the environment and create unique habitat for other species. So some of the ways that eelgrass creates unique habitat is that they alter the local physicochemical conditions where these eelgrass beds occur. So one of these things is that because of the thick leaves that occur within an eelgrass bed, it essentially dampens currents and waves as they're coming across that eelgrass bed, and thus can have some protective component for shorelines on the other side of eelgrass beds. I mentioned earlier that these blades can help trap and stabilize sediments, improving water quality. Similarly, they can also alter nutrient cycles, since they actively utilize nutrients in photosynthesis. One of the newer kind of features that have started to be described is that they seem to have some potential effect to mediate the effects of ocean acidification and hypoxia. Because they photosynthesize, they decrease the amount of local CO2 in the water and can produce oxygen here. And some recent studies have shown that this can moderate the effect of ocean acidification effects on shellfish. So this figure here on the right, which is from the Washington Department of Natural Resources, shows that in eelgrass habitat relative to bare tide flat or oysters, shows that actually as water passes through the eelgrass, that the pH is actually decreasing, so the water is becoming less acidic as it's going through the eelgrass bed. And so obviously then if there are other shellfish, whether they're oysters or clams, that can moderate the impact of ocean acidification effects on those species. In addition, the root rhizome system represents carbon that's stored in the sediments, which can potentially store CO2 for a long period of time, and potentially mitigate the effects of anthropogenic CO2 in the atmosphere. And so this concept is, again, a fairly new concept, but it's called blue carbon. So you can see lots of articles and stuff talking about blue carbon for eelgrass, as well as salt marshes and other important habitats in the estuary. Eelgrass also creates living habitat that's used by a number of species. Anyone who's been on the bay in late winter, early spring have seen brant geese in eelgrass beds. These migratory birds utilize Netarts Bay during their winter stopover, and they often feed directly on eelgrass in the bay, as you can see in some of these photos here. There are also a number of smaller plants, microscopic algae and attached macroalgae that grow on eelgrass leaves. And I can see that in this picture here. These are called epiphytes, which is a word that just means on the plant. Also on the leaves are a number of small invertebrates called mesograzers that feed almost exclusively on these epiphytes. So these are species that would not occur in the estuary without eelgrass. So these pictures here are some common mesograzers that you can find in Netarts Bay eelgrass beds. They include small crustaceans like amphipods and isopods, some snails, and sea hare. That's shown here, and you can see a smaller one of those sea hares crawling on the blade of this eelgrass here. These photos here show how important these mesograzers can be for eelgrass. On the left are eelgrass leaves, heavily covered by epiphytes, and then on the right is the same eelgrass bed, but after a period of time where there are abundant mesograzers within it. And so the mesograzers can graze down these epiphytes and essentially clean the leaves enough so that the eelgrass plant can be more efficient with their photosynthesis and grow faster. The complex structure of eelgrass habitat, represented by all the interwoven leaves, are also sites of high biodiversity in estuaries. The leaves provide protection for small invertebrate and fishes by making it difficult for visual predators to see the abundant prey in the eelgrass bed. The leaf structure also slows down currents in the eelgrass bed. So when these small invertebrates are reproducing their larvae, which are in the water column, then can settle close to where the adults are, and it just increases the size of the population. And then finally, the high productivity of the eelgrass plants themselves provide a rich food resource that permits more of these small organisms to coexist and grow. So this leads to high biodiversity and biomass that's characteristic of eelgrass habitats. So one local example of this is gaper clams here from Tillamook Bay. The map on the left is the northern portion of the Bay Ocean tide flat on the backside of the Bay Ocean Peninsula. The green areas are mapped eelgrass beds on this tide flat. And then all of these dots, both these small black dots and all these purple dots, represent sites that my team has sampled during our field surveys. The large purple circles represent essentially high densities of gaper clams that we found during our survey. So here there's both high abundance and biomass of gapers that are almost exclusively found here within the eelgrass bed and not in the unvegetated areas that are near the eelgrass bed. Eelgrass is also an important nursery area for many species. Nursery area is an area juvenile habitat with high abundance, growth, and survival. So another way to think about this is if a juvenile grows up in an eelgrass bed, they're more likely to survive to be an adult relative to juveniles that grow up in other habitat types within the estuary. And so one example that I'm sure we're all familiar if you spent some time out on the tide flats are dungeness crab. Here is the same tide flat in Tillamook Bay with the map on the left, but this time showing in red where there are high abundances of juvenile dungeness crab. So eelgrass is an important habitat for juvenile dungeness crabs, especially during their first year after settlement. And this video that's showing on the left-hand side is a video, I'll just go to where it's super abundant, of hundreds of thousands of little baby dungeness crab that are settling into an eelgrass bed in Coos Bay that we captured during our field surveys when we were there. So these ecosystem services I've described form the basis for much of the protection and conservation of eelgrass in estuaries. So eelgrass is considered essential fish habitat by NOAA fisheries and protected habitat by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. In addition, they're an important habitat for managed shellfish species, such as the program that I work for, the shellfish program of ODFW. And it's also an Oregon conservation strategy species, so it has some protections and preservations because of that. Thus, any activities that impact eelgrass beds are regulated by both federal and state agencies in Oregon. So some examples of the types of activities that that ODFW would be involved in would be permits related to shoreline development, dredge and fill activities within the estuary, and applications for new aquaculture activities in estuaries, and whether or not they have an impact on eelgrass present in the system. So now that I've convinced you that eelgrass is awesome, I'll pull out a bucket of cold water and let you know that there are some threats to eelgrass. Eelgrass and other seagrass species have been declining globally. These losses are due to a number of threats and human impacts, including a specific pathogen called seagrass wasting disease, algae blooms driven by poor water quality within the estuary, dredging and shoreline alterations, aquaculture, climate change, and sea level rise. In general, Oregon has not seen the losses of eelgrass that have been noted in other regions of the US, which is good news. However, there have been some recent observations of rapid loss of eelgrass beds in Pacific estuaries. On the left is an example from Southern California, Morro Bay. This is located near San Luis Obispo, and there was a rapid loss of 95% of the eelgrass beds within the bay in under a decade. And so the figure on the left shows surveys that they were conducting there in 2007, with all the green representing extensive eelgrass beds that occurred within the estuary, and then subsequent survey in 2015 that only had these beds right by the mouth of the bay, and loss of all of these eelgrass beds in that time period. Around the same time, there was a dramatic loss of eelgrass in just 2 years, observed in South Slough, one of the sub-estuaries of Coos Bay on the south coast. And so this is a photo of this eelgrass bed that have been part of a long-term monitoring program in Coos Bay. And you can see that this entire tide flat is covered with eelgrass, as well as, you know, they're pulling up in the boat and you can see a lot of the subtidal eelgrass there. And in 2017, it's essentially this little patch of eelgrass is all that's left at this location. The challenging aspects of these occurrences was that there was no clearly defined cause, despite the fact that both of these locations had extensive monitoring programs. So Morro Bay is actually an estuary in the National Estuary Program, similar to Tillamook Bay. And South Slough is in the National Estuarine Research Reserve System, which has a long-term monitoring program over the last several decades. So the worry is that there are a number of other estuaries within the Pacific Northwest and Pacific region without monitoring programs that are seeing similar declines. So science to the rescue. To better understand and respond to the eelgrass losses, a group of eelgrass biologists, including myself, up and down the West Coast, came together to better understand the underlying causes and try to work together on a recovery plan for the affected regions. During this workshop, we ranked the major stressors impacting eelgrass beds. So I kind of have them as a list here. And you can see a lot of overlap with the broader list of threats to eelgrass. But one of the real big take homes here is regionally, the threats can be quite different depending on where you are along the coast. As you will see in the next portion of the talk, Netarts eelgrass beds are in really good shape, even with the recent increase of non-native eelgrass within the bay. So we have been talking broadly about eelgrass ecology in Oregon and Pacific Northwest estuaries. The last section of my talk will present results from my project, the Seeker project in ODFW, and our surveys on eelgrass and shellfish communities in Netarts Bay. Specifically, I'll briefly review a little more background on non-native eelgrass, Zostera japonica, and eelgrass bed types found in Netarts Bay, the distribution of these eelgrass bed types, shellfish species associated with the different eelgrass bed types, and then finally, a little bit about emerging technologies we are developing to help us better understand the distribution and dynamics of eelgrass beds in Netarts Bay and other Oregon estuaries. So why has Zostera japonica been expanding in the Pacific Northwest? Well, this species is native to Asia, but was accidentally introduced to the Pacific Northwest through oyster aquaculture in the 1930s. And if you flash back to that time period, that was before we really had local hatcheries developed. And so the seed that would be used for Pacific oyster aquaculture was actually shipped over from Japan. And it turns out some of those imported oysters were actually packed in Zostera japonica for the trip across the Pacific, which likely led to a transport of seeds and live plants that ended up in our local estuaries. However, although they were introduced 90 years ago, it's only in the last 20 years that we've seen a rapid expansion of this non-native eelgrass in Oregon estuaries. Part of the reason the species has been successful is that it has some weedy life history characteristics. It has a broader salinity and temperature tolerance than native eelgrass, so it can occur higher up on the intertidal because it doesn't have the issues with desiccation and temperature stress that the native eelgrass has at those tide heights. It produces a lot of flowering shoots and seeds, which allows rapid expansion of the population and occurs in high shoot density. However, Zostera japonica primarily colonizes unvegetated areas of the upper intertidal areas of the estuaries. So there is often limited overlap with native eelgrass, and thus not as many competitors for space in that location. Interestingly, one exception to this pattern is Netarts Bay. So in Netarts Bay, there's actually now 4 eelgrass bed types that occur within the estuary. And so in the so this figure here shows these 4 bed types that I'll be talking about, and relative to conceptually what the tide height is. And so here would be mean tide level, and so this is negative tide areas down here, which is primarily just native eelgrass, Zostera marina. As you go up the tide flat, you then have this area which are mixed eelgrass beds, which include both the native and non-native species. And then as you get pretty high up on the intertidal, then you start to see beds that are just the non-native species, and then you have areas that are unvegetated. This provides an ideal system as an ecologist to better understand Zostera japonica effects both on the native eelgrass as well as on shellfish species that occur within the estuary. And more importantly, all of these bed types can be found at the same tide height, permitting comparison of these different eelgrass bed types within the system. So my group used survey data to document the distribution of these different bed types and shellfish communities associated with these habitats. So in 2013 and 14, we conducted a comprehensive shellfish community and estuarine habitat survey of Netarts Bay. And this included a subset of sites where only habitat information was collected, represented by these blue points, and then a subset of random sites with habitat sampling paired with shellfish data at the same location, represented by these black points on the map. This approach permitted us to have both eelgrass bed type information and the shellfish community associated with each bed type. So this map shows the distribution of the different eelgrass bed types in the bay. So unvegetated habitat is represented by this light brown color. Zostera japonica, so the non-native eelgrass, is represented by this orange color. The mixed eelgrass beds with both native and non-native species is this dark green, and then this bright green represents the native Zostera marina only area of the estuary. So Zostera japonica has altered the intertidal habitat. There's now extensive overlap with native eelgrass, especially in the middle and upper portions of the bay. and that currently, or at least as of 2014, non-native eelgrass habitat comprised a little over 30% of the intertidal area of the bay. One of the questions we had was whether the expansion of the non-native eelgrass was altering native eelgrass distribution. Well, ODFW did conduct a similar survey of eelgrass in 1977 across much of the bay. We overlaid the results of that study, which are the brown and green squares in this map on the left, over top of this green polygon, which would be our map of native eelgrass distribution from our 2013-2014 survey. If you compare the 1977 distribution to our recent survey, there's no real change in Zostera marina distribution relative to surveys conducted 40 years ago, and in some cases, it's even expanded. And another thing that came out of this was that even in those areas where we had the mixed eelgrass beds, that it was the native eelgrass that was the dominant eelgrass in most of those mixed eelgrass beds. It wasn't the non-native that was dominating those habitats. I mentioned earlier that we wanted to compare shellfish communities across eelgrass bed types to see if there are differences in the species found among the habitats. Here I have plotted the distribution of the eelgrass bed types from unvegetated, Zostera japonica, mixed, and native eelgrass across a range of tidal heights from -1 tide to +2 meter tide along this lower axis. And for purposes of the shellfish comparison, we use this +0.5 to 1.0 tide bin where we saw the greatest amount of all 4 habitats co-occurring to compare the shellfish communities that exist within that. When we conducted these analysis of shellfish communities among these habitat types, we found strong relationships between shellfish community structure that could be used to distinguish among these different habitats. And so unvegetated habitats were distinct from all of the eelgrass habitats over here, and that the communities had a gradient between native to mixed eelgrass to non-native eelgrass communities. And so finally, we wanted to identify the species composition that might be driving the differences that we saw in that community analysis. The diagram here shows a comparison of indicator species whose relative biomass or density could be used to distinguish among the different eelgrass bed types. Species with asterisks, so like that asterisk right there, are indicative of a species that was unique to a given habitat. The relative size of our little icon for the different species is proportional to the biomass found in the different habitats. So the first group of species that we found were those that were most strongly associated with native eelgrass only habitats. So they include mud shrimp, juvenile dungeness crab, and one of the Makoma clams, the pointed Makoma, that occurs within Oregon estuaries. And so in this case, it was this pointed Makoma that was the species that was characteristic and only found primarily in the native eelgrass beds. In other habitats, we see either decreases in density and biomass, for example, in both mixed and Zostera japonica, you see reduced amounts of some of those species, and then in unvegetated, you don't find any of these eelgrass associated species of shellfish. Second, there are a set of species that are unique to particular habitats, and so they're only found in these 2 habitats. So this includes the eastern softshell clam in Zostera japonica habitat and the purple varnish clam in unvegetated areas. Interestingly, these are both introduced species, so not native to Oregon estuaries, but these species were not found in native or mixed eelgrass habitats. And then finally, there's a group of species that we kind of call cosmopolitan bivalves because they're found across a broad spectrum of habitats and tide heights. So these include butter clams, native little neck clams, and bent nose Makoma clams. And so the relative density or biomass differs among the different habitat types. For example, there's a consistent gradient of increasing bent nose Macoma clams going from the unvegetated to the non-native eelgrass to the mixed eelgrass to the native eelgrass habitat. Thus, there are species compositional differences and numbers and weight of those species within these different habitats that permit us to distinguish among these different eelgrass bed types in Netarts Bay, and that these differences in these communities explain the patterns that we found in our Netarts Bay shellfish survey. So in summary, Zostra japonica has colonized intertidal areas of Netarts Bay, reduced unvegetated areas, and have been expanding into the Zostra marina beds. However, expansion of the non-native eelgrass has not yet altered the distribution of native eelgrass in the bay. Second, there were predictable differences in shellfish community structure in each of the eelgrass bed types, and that eelgrass habitat, whether native or non-native, supported populations of recreationally important shellfish that will need to be considered when making management decisions about the non-native eelgrass in this bay. So, the big take home is that these results increase our understanding of the potential ecological impacts of Zostra japonica in Oregon estuaries, and it will be used by the agency to make decisions on management of this non-native eelgrass. And so in this final section of the talk, I'd like to discuss kind of one of the emerging technologies that we're testing to improve our ability to map eelgrass. And so unmanned aircraft systems, or UAS, permit rapid collection of aerial imagery of intertidal and some shallow subtidal habitats. The primary goals of this technology from the ODFW perspective is to evaluate the utility of UAS to map estuarine habitats, complement our ground surveys, and increase the frequency and resolution of our eelgrass maps for Oregon estuaries. And so on the left here is an actual part of an image from this aerial imagery where you can see native eelgrass here, macroalgae, and you can actually, the resolution is high enough that you can actually see gaper siphons on the surface of the sediment. So we've been using UAS to map a 3-acre area of Netarts Bay since 2016 using a Seeker quadcopter system equipped with a high-resolution camera. The imagery here is the result of one of these surveys. So the resolution in this orthophoto here is 6 millimeters, which is orders of magnitude greater than the 3 to 9 meter resolution possible from our field surveys. And in addition, with the UAS, we can image 100 to 200 acres per day, so that we could do full coverage of much of the Netarts Bay eelgrass beds in a couple of weeks. For context, our field surveys typically take 2 years to complete the same area. This map here is an example of habitat classification maps that can be used using that imagery. So here we were able to take that imagery and when combined with our field crews out doing ground truth sites at that location, we could define areas that had eelgrass, which are the dark blue is native eelgrass, the light blue is non-native eelgrass, and then the 2 tones of yellow here are different types of benthic macroalgae. And we could tease this out using this imagery to create this new map of the distribution of those habitats. One of the major goals of incorporating UAS was to be able to track eelgrass population dynamics in time and space. And so the habitat maps here are that same location, but flown in 2 separate years. So in the peak growing season of eelgrass, we flew this in 2016 and 2017. And here I just have the one color for all of the eelgrass. But you can see that between the eelgrass and the macroalgae, you can see these clear shifts in distributions that have occurred between these 2 years. And so in our regular field surveys, we would revisit an estuary every 10 years. So we might not capture any of these small scale changes or how rapidly these changes are actually occurring. And so that's the hope in incorporating the UAS technology to complement our field surveys, is that we would be able to have a better idea of these temporal dynamics. And if there are shifts or changes that are occurring, that we can rapidly go out and quantify that and see how rapidly the eelgrass beds might be shifting in the estuary. So I hope you've gained an appreciation for eelgrass and Netarts Bay and Oregon estuaries and come away with a better understanding of these important habitats. And I'll hang on here for a good 10, 15 minutes or so. And Chrissy will just moderate and share questions that I will answer for you.
Great, thank you, Tony, so much. We do have some questions that came in the chat, Tony, so you probably can read some of them yourself as I'm posing them to the group. We did have a question about eelgrass declines. Did the eelgrass declines happen slowly over the years or rapidly within a year or two? And I think you started to address this in your presentation, but and it was asked early on, but maybe just a recap. Great.
Yeah, the one case in Morro Bay was a more gradual, in that it occurred over 7 or 8 years. The one in Coos Bay was a very dramatic change. That was essentially it dropped 50% one year and then another 40% the next year. So it was a pretty dramatic, rapid change, and we just didn't expect that could occur.
That's pretty interesting. The next question is about, it says, do the brant feed on the japonica as much as they do the native species?
That I can't quite say, just because we don't have direct observations of that. I know that I've noticed it on the native species because when I was out there in that time of year, actually looking at the species, you can actually see the sections of the eelgrass bed that the brant have fed on, because essentially the eelgrass blade is basically a clean cut right near the base of the blade for that.
Gotcha. What percentage of eelgrass habitat is leased and used for oyster production in Tillamook Bay? If eelgrass is a protected species, why are commercial producers allowed to use mechanical dredges and harrows?
Excellent questions. A large portion of the oyster aquaculture leases in Netarts Bay do occur in areas where there are eelgrass. And as part of the permitting process, there are restrictions in place for the producer to avoid areas of high densities of eelgrass, so they can only work parts of their leases with lower densities. As far as mechanical dredges and harrows, that isn't something that occurs in Netarts Bay. And the only place I know of that it does occur is in Tillamook Bay, and that is an old permit that is still able to be used by that producer. I know in other portions of the Pacific Northwest that is a very common process. So like a lot of the oyster aquaculture operations in Washington State do a lot of harrowing to flip and maintain the growing oysters near the surface, but that's not something we commonly have in Oregon estuaries. And I know that at least in my time within the shellfish program, which would be 11 years, we haven't approved any permit for any mechanical dredging or harrowing related to an oyster aquaculture operation.
Great, good question. Has C-Corp prepared a cost-benefit analysis of removing the japonica, eelgrass, and Netarts Bay? Is it worth the effort?
Very good and interesting question. And I would say that we haven't specifically done a cost benefit. There's definitely been colleagues of ours at Oregon State University and University of Washington that have evaluated various methods to remove Netarts Bay. remove Zostera japonica. And unfortunately, the only efficient method that has come out is the actual use of herbicides. And so that's primarily what's used in California and Washington to remove Zostera japonica. And it's part of the reason that we're resistant to manage Zostera japonica that way, because all of the studies that we've reviewed related to that is that those herbicides have the same negative effect on native eelgrass, as well as a number of important invertebrate species that we manage.
Know all of that management is happening. How did you do the classification of the UAS imagery? Was it a manual or using any automated classification? Was the UAS imagery capable of discriminating between the two eelgrass species?
Okay. Yes and yes. Now, the classification of the UAS imagery was used a process called guided classification. And so that is, we had specific ground truth sites where we measured the known amounts of native and non-native eelgrass and used that to kind of train the person that was doing the classification. And then as they developed that, then the rest of the process could be automated, which we could then double check with the remaining ground truth sites. It is challenging to discriminate between the two eelgrass species because many of the common methods that are used to discriminate between plant species are things like color infrared and other types of light spectra imaging systems, but they just see eelgrass as eelgrass because the chlorophyll is the same in the two plant species, so you can't distinguish that way. So it does require quite a bit of ground truth work in order to clearly distinguish between those in the imagery.
Yeah, that's a super interesting project. And I know that, you know, Webb's board member, Claire Thomas, who is also with the school district, has helped lead some students in doing similar projects, looking at, I think you've helped guide some of those things, but using the similar technology of using drones and imagery to capture oyster populations in the bay. So
yeah, and I will say that locally here on the Central Coast, I've been working, and our group has been working with the Coastal Drone Academy, which is based in Lincoln City. So it's a technical high school that trains high school kids to have commercial drone licenses when they graduate high school. And so they've been working with us to do a lot of the flights that we've been doing in Netarts Bay with a lot of commercial grade drone systems. And one of the other teachers in that high school is specifically interested in the aquaculture aspects of that.
that's cool. Yeah, that's a great way to engage kids. Yeah. Are there any known medical benefits, and can it be harvested responsibly?
Of eelgrass, or that's the hard thing to answer there.
I know. I think so. But feel free to clarify. Whoever asked that question. I think yeah. Perhaps if it was the non-native species that we might be discussing.
I am not aware of the medicinal benefits of either eelgrass species, but that does not mean they don't exist. It just means I might not know what they are.
Gotcha. Yeah. And any thoughts on harvesting eelgrass from your ODFW perspective?
It is a protected habitat. Mm-hmm. So let me leave it out there as that. There aren't any particular rules in place that specifically says you can't do that, but it is protected habitat in Oregon, and I would say you just have to be prepared to make your case to the Oregon State Police wildlife officer.
Good, thank you. I know that the non-native eelgrass is sometimes called dwarf grass. Is that am I remembering that correctly?
Yep.
So I have a question actually about its length. What is the average length of the non-native eelgrass?
They can be quite short, so they can be anywhere between, I would guess, like 4 to 8 inches when when the leaves are fully grown. And in some parts of Netarts Bay, they can even be shorter. They tend to have a lot more leaves rather than long leaves.
Excellent. For those of you that aren't as familiar with the two different species, once you see them side by side, it becomes pretty obvious. We actually have Jim Young shared a picture of that with us. We posted it online. So if anybody wants to see a really close up side by side again, you can go there and check that out. The next question says, I understand the grasses occur in intertidal shallow areas, but is there a role for recreational scuba divers to play in observing, reporting problems, cleaning up the bay that could be helpful?
I would say yes. I'm not sure exactly the best approach for that, but I can definitely discuss that idea with Steve Rumrell, who's the shellfish program leader, to see what we can do. I know that we encourage people, if they have either pictures or general observations in a given bay, to feel free to report it to the local ODFW office. You could even send that information either directly to me on my email address there, or you can contact either the Newport Marine Resources Program office, or if you want to just report it locally to the Tillamook office, they would just contact us about any of those types of observations.
Great. Yeah, so that's a let me know if something comes of that, because I would like to know more. Does the non-native eelgrass also, so I want to just kind of be nice to revisit this topic, because I know some people were popping in here at different times during the presentation, and even a couple joined just recently, which is totally okay. So the question was, does non-native eelgrass also help mitigate ocean acidification and contribute to carbon?
More on the ocean acidification side than for the blue carbon side, just because they don't have a lot of, because part of the whole idea of blue carbon is it's things like marshes or mangroves or seagrass beds that have fairly large root systems that then become part of the soil or sediment system. And so then the carbon that it used to create those parts get trapped and just maintain themselves within the sediments. In contrast, Zostera japonica doesn't have a lot of investment in their root and rhizome system, so there's not a lot of biomass there, so they aren't as important from the blue carbon perspective, but they occur in extremely high densities, so as water passes across them, you're going to have the same beneficial effects as far as absorbing carbon and locally moderating the pH and ocean acidification conditions there. It probably is just less pronounced than the eelgrass, because when we just talked about kind of the blade size, if it's something that's only 6 inches long versus something that's 6 feet long, that obviously that seagrass bed that has all 6 foot long beds has a much more dramatic effect on the water that's passing through that bed than the smaller japonica eelgrass beds.
Great. So I have another, I know we're about to wrap up here. I know you're giving us till 7. I have a couple questions here. I'm just filtering in from Facebook. So one question was, how many hours of drone flying is involved in your surveys, and what is the impact to people in and around the survey area?
Oh, good question as well. Most of our drone flights, so that that 2.5 acre area that I show is it's 20 minutes is that flight. And so we usually try to time it where the tides work for us, but there aren't folks out on that section of the tide flat. So that's an area that's not an area that's extremely popular with the recreational climbers. So it's on the other side of the main channel in Netarts Bay to reduce that. And then the other drones that are flown by the Drone Academy fly very high up. So they're up hundreds of feet when they're taking the imagery. And those flights, again, take anywhere between 20 to 60 minutes at a time.
Great. We have one clarifying question about eelgrass versus kelp. They are different species, but some questions that have come up lately here too that I'm just going to throw out there because it's not all posed here, but partially posed here. Kelp, eelgrass in Netarts Bay versus kelp in Netarts Bay. Can you speak to that, Tony?
I'm not sure exactly how much kelp there is in Netarts Bay. They are definitely different species. The kelp tend to be able to grow in deeper water. So I'm not sure what kelp you're referring to.
Right. A lot of different species of kelp.
Yeah. So if it's like the intertidal kind of sugar kelp, associated with like some of the kind of rocky cobble beach areas, those are areas that are not really amenable for seagrass populations. So they would only be kelp in those rocky shore areas, as opposed to, because once you get offshore, you tend to have very little eelgrass populations because of the high wave energy and the low light penetration out there.
Awesome. Great. Yeah, well, thank you everybody for joining. Tony, love it. I'm so happy that you're willing to do this, and we hope everybody has a wonderful night.